Um, our next speaker is Dr. Peter Saxton. He's a senior lecturer at Auckland University. He's the inaugural New Zealand AIDS Foundation Fellow in the School of Population Health and Director of the Gay Men's Sexual Health Research Group, and has a joint appointment with the AIDS Epidemiology Group at the University of Otago. And Peter is going to be speaking to us about blood donation criteria, which is an exciting opportunity. So thank you, Peter.
Kia ora tātou, ko Peter Saxton tōku ingoa. Thank you, Mark, for the kind invitation to present today on blood donation. And also a thank you to Minister Verrill for leading the country's COVID-19 response, which must be one of the top-ranked response internationally. But also, as you've heard, a long series of contributions to HIV and to sexual health over many years. And at the helm of some quite significant changes in our sector currently. So thank you. So I'm ready to share screen, Chris. Okay, well, hi everyone. So again, Mark's asked me to talk about blood donation. So some of the changes to blood donor deferral policy and how that aligns with HIV and our most affected groups. So I'm going to talk a little bit at the start about some contextual factors that I think we need to consider when we're thinking about how to improve blood donor policy, so keeping it safe, but making it more inclusive. Then some of the changes in New Zealand themselves that launched last year. And finally, introducing, as Minister Verrill said, an exciting new study, probably the biggest we've ever undertaken on both blood donation and HIV prevention in the new combination prevention era. So this photo might be familiar to many of you. This is in Orlando, Florida, after a gunman killed 49 people at a gay nightclub. Now, following this, the gay community lined up outside to donate blood, but were rejected because of the US policy around men who have sex with men at the time. And here in New Zealand, here's a gay couple who wanted to donate blood. One of them actually had a rare blood type. They were also rejected. So to them, that felt obviously unfair, but also a wasted opportunity to help someone with a rare blood disorder benefit from their offer to donate. So clearly we need to improve blood donation policy. And there are a number of things that I think we need to think about as we strive to make it not just safe, but also more inclusive. So the first thing, I guess, is the epidemiological context in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, on the left, as we know, HIV affects many different types of individuals. But when we think about HIV that's acquired in New Zealand, so locally transmitted HIV, the picture is a lot more concentrated. So in the blue, of all the new diagnoses where people felt they acquired HIV in New Zealand, the vast majority are among MSM. In fact, in 2019, that number was about 76%. So it's highly concentrated when we think of local transmission patterns. And because those new diagnoses amongst MSM are happening on a small base population, so we estimate, I think, around 35 to 40,000 MSM living in New Zealand, the notification rate of HIV is really quite high. So this is data from a paper that we just published last week, in fact, and it shows that for gay and bisexual men, the HIV notification rate in 2019 was 158 per 100,000, compared to just 0.5 amongst heterosexual men and women. And what that means is that the average gay and bisexual man has around 348 times the likelihood of being notified with HIV compared to the average heterosexual man or woman. And as you can see, those magnifiers are also still quite significant for syphilis and also for gonorrhea. Moreover, when, as Minister Verrill mentioned, we actually conducted an HIV prevalence survey in 2011, this is in gay community settings in Auckland, we found that 6% of our gay and bisexual men who took part were living with HIV. And of those, 1 in 5, in fact, weren't aware they had HIV. So they had undiagnosed infection and obviously weren't benefiting from treatments and may not have been engaging in safe sex. So that helps us estimate that around 1.3% of all gay and bisexual men, certainly in Auckland, were living with undiagnosed HIVs, or 1 in 77 individuals. And that was 10 years ago when we used oral fluids sampling, and we're going to update that, as Mr. Verrill said, in a new study that I'll talk about shortly. Thinking about those small number, it has to be say, of undiagnosed individuals, there was quite a diversity. So we know that many had in fact tested for HIV in the past, and some quite recently. They tested negative. And most of them, in fact, currently were quite confident that they didn't have HIV. And this picture, I guess, of disproportionate impact is seen when we conduct sentinel surveillance in different populations and different settings around the country. So the same pattern emerges of very low levels of HIV prevalence in most groups, but a relatively higher level of HIV and perhaps undiagnosed HIV amongst gay and bisexual men. So again, this is a pretty stable picture. It's remained the same over many years, and points to the disproportionate burden that we know MSM experience in New Zealand. So that's pretty much stayed the same, but we know many other things have changed. And amongst those, since 2015 in particular, we have seen a revolution in the prevention of HIV. So referring to concepts like combination HIV prevention and biomedical HIV prevention, some enormous changes there. And these are happening on top of condoms. So we know, of course, that condoms still work very effectively to prevent HIV and other STIs. This is one of my favourite statements from the expert consensus statement on the science of HIV that was launched at the World AIDS Conference in Amsterdam in 2018. And it's got statements like, HIV cannot pass through the intact walls of latex condom. Correct and consistent use of condoms means that HIV transmission is not possible. So we build on top of this very successful base that we've had going for many years in New Zealand. But on top of this, we add things like test and treat and undetectable viral loads. So we're using treatments to eliminate transmission, and based on highly engaged and well-designed clinical trials in different populations, we know that people living with undetectable viral load that's been consistently suppressed effectively have a zero chance of transmitting HIV to their sexual partners. I think that's a really important caveat. This is in the context of sex. So that last study, the Partner 2 trial, which of serodiscordant couples, so one person living with HIV that was diagnosed, treated and effectively suppressed, and their negative partner, you can see after 76,000 acts of condomless sex, there was still no HIV transmission. So the science here is really, really robust. We also know that treatments work well for people without HIV and stops them from contracting HIV. So with pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, a number of trials, both clinical trials and real-world setting trials and demonstration projects, have shown that this really does work in the real world. And in fact, if someone takes PrEP per protocol, it's up to, in fact, about 99% protective. So here in New Zealand, when we look at ongoing behavioural surveillance, we see that gay men have adapted many of these new prevention options. This is data from gay and bisexual men in Auckland who are having casual anal sex, and it shows that over time the mix of prevention options has changed. So in green, consistent condom use has certainly declined, but there's been an incredible growth in the proportion engaging in PrEP on the blue. And in 2019, we can see that most gay men having casual sex, in fact, are adopting some form of combination prevention. So they're either using condoms, they're either on PrEP, or they're testing very, very frequently. And this is having an incredible impact on our local epidemic. So we know that since PrEP became available, we've seen this reduction in the total number of new diagnoses amongst MSM. This is again in Auckland, but especially so when we think about incident HIV in the blue. So there's been a 65% drop in incident HIV, which is newly acquired HIV. And we know this because on presentation, people had a CD4 count of over 500. So again, this is working. The combination of condoms, of PrEP, of U equals U, of regular testing really is driving the epidemic down in Auckland and hopefully the rest of the country. And we have this opportunity to eliminate HIV and be one of the first countries to do so. And what it's also doing is encouraging us to reimagine what we think about when we're talking about HIV transmission risk. We're used to talking about condomless anal sex, but now we have to think about risk at an event level. So not just what a participant is doing, whether they're using condoms, whether they're using PrEP, whether they're on treatments, but also what their partner is doing. So this picture has become a whole lot more complicated, and we need to start factoring that in, not only to HIV prevention, but also to other public policy issues like blood donation. But the third thing I want to touch upon, I think is equally as significant as the first two. And that's the fact that in New Zealand, we're now living in one of the most rainbow-friendly countries in the world. So there are many rainbow individuals who are participating at all levels of society. We have very strong human rights protections. And I think the default expectation is that rainbow individuals ought to be included rather than excluded in important cultural institutions and social experiences. And we see that the same thing is happening amongst our wider communities and allies. This is a photo from the Big Gay Out this year. And I think the expectation again is that if someone has a gay best friend or a gay son or a gay brother, that the idea that they might be excluded from things like blood donation really is quite anathema to many Kiwis. So these are the three threads I think I want us to think about as we're thinking about how we can improve blood donation policy, particularly for MSM in New Zealand. Now, it's fair to say that blood donation policy doesn't change quickly. So internationally, we've seen different countries move quite slowly when they've wanted to adopt and improve their blood donor policies because they wanted to do so on evidence, and that hasn't always been forthcoming. In 2014 in New Zealand, in fact, we shifted from a 5-year deferral down to a 12-month deferral for many groups, including MSM and sex workers. And at the time, that actually positioned New Zealand as one of probably in the top 5 most liberal countries for blood donor deferral. But as you can see from this table, certainly in the last few years, probably since 2017, many countries have overtaken us. And so, but in particular, the UK and Canada have really driven changes to the way they conceive blood donation policy and are moving to a more individualised policy. But as many of you know, in December last year, New Zealand Blood Service announced that it was changing again and moving from the 12-month deferral down to a 3-month deferral for MSM. Now, this is the detail of what some of those deferral policies mean for different groups. And I apologise for the small text. I have got a link at the last slide if you want a link to a summary. But I want to touch on just 3 things. First of all, near the top, again, this is a behaviour-based deferral for MSM. It isn't based on sexual identity. So it does require someone to have had sex, oral or anal sex, with or without a condom with another man, for that 3-month deferral to be triggered. So it is behaviour, but of course it's a very broad behavioural definition. The other thing I want to highlight is actually a new criteria which relates to PrEP. So PrEP is new since the 2014 blood donation. The last time we did the blood donation review. And in fact, PrEP still triggers deferral even if someone hasn't been having sex. And that's because the presence of residual PrEP in someone's blood system might mask a recently acquired infection. So PrEP still triggers a 3-month deferral. And I also want to touch upon the deferral for people living with HIV. This has been a permanent deferral in the past, and that permanent deferral still remains. And that's true regardless if someone is on treatment and regardless of if someone is on undetectable viral load. And so it's really important to emphasize that this concept that we're also familiar with of U equals U is U equals U in the context of sex. It's not U equals U in the context of other activities, in particular blood donation. And that's partly because blood donation and receiving blood transfusions is a highly efficient way of transmitting HIV. So if there is HIV in that blood transfusion, there's around 93% chance that that HIV will be transmitted to the person needing blood. So of course, it generated an awful lot of interest in the community and in the media, and we engaged with that in December. But as you can see from some of these headlines, despite moving from a 12-month to a 3-month deferral, I think for many individuals, this still equated to a ban. It still required people to be, I guess, going without sex for at least 3 months to be eligible if you're an MSM. So this is probably the most common question that I get. You know, if we've got HIV testing and we rely upon this in public health, why can't we just test for HIV and do away with deferral? It's really important to emphasize that every individual blood donation is in fact tested. And so the testing will indeed detect all prevalent HIV infections in blood that's donated. So prevalent infections relates to long-standing infections. So someone has been living with HIV, even undetected for quite a long time. However, the problem is, despite having these state-of-the-art tests and proprietary tests in laboratories, there is still a small but not zero chance that a recently acquired, what we call an incident undiagnosed infection, will in fact be missed by that testing regime. So what we call window period infections. And I think, again, we're all familiar with this concept of window period infections from our community testing regimes. So in New Zealand and in fact all around the world, blood safety services have a combination approach. So the safety of the blood supply is maintained not just by testing, but also by the deferral of individuals whose behaviour puts them at a higher probability of having an undiagnosed incident infection. Again, that can be a very small probability, but it is a relatively higher probability than other people in that particular setting, based on that country's particular epidemiology of HIV. And this, again, is familiar, I think, to many of us through the COVID experience. So again, with COVID, we know that safety is not just based on one layer of protection, it's in fact multiple layers of protection, each of which have a tiny risk of failure, but in combination provide a really robust safeguard. So again, this leads us to, I think, at least three conundrums that we have to weigh up. First of all, what we call the epidemiological conundrum. We know that in New Zealand, MSM are disproportionately affected by HIV. That's, of course, why we focus our HIV prevention efforts on our communities. But that, of course, is a group-based statistic. And we also know that many individual MSM probably present a low absolute risk to the blood supply because of their own behaviours. And we can think about some examples where this might be true. It might be people in long-term monogamous couples. It might be individuals who have sex but avoid certain activities. The other conundrum is what we might call the social good conundrum. So society portrays donating blood as a valued civic act and confers certain benefits and social prestige on people who donate blood. But MSM, of course, are excluded from that and therefore are excluded from enjoying the benefits of that social prestige. That wouldn't be a problem if, in fact, MSM didn't want to donate, but we know from overseas experiences that many MSM do. They want to donate blood, they want to be altruistic, they want to do their part and do their civic duty. And also, equally, we know that this is deeply unscientific. It is always in some way contradicted the safe sex advice that many of our peak organisations, like the AIDS Foundation, like Body Positive, like Te Whare Ki Whakapō, have given to our communities effectively over many, many years. That's always been true for the oral sex deferral. We know that oral sex is not an important route of HIV transmission, so we know that it contradicts the safe sex advice. But increasingly, particularly since the era of biomedical prevention, it contradicts what individuals believe themselves about their own risk. We know the evidence about PrEP. We know the evidence about U equals U in the sexual context. So it makes sense that many people who are using these prevention approaches genuinely believe that they pose zero risk in the context of not just sexual activity, but also blood donation. So I think drawing all this together, one of the implications is that policies around blood donation that are seen as unfair, that are seen as unscientific and are seen as discriminatory might in fact be ignored. Now, I want to emphasize that we don't have evidence that's true, but it's important because it creates a compliance problem for the blood service and also for recipients of blood products. So reforming blood donation policy, improving it, keeping the safety, but improving its inclusiveness is not just the right thing to do, it's also the necessary thing to do. And that's because of increasingly people viewed the blood donor policies as out of date, as unscientific, it increases the chances that people will donate when they probably shouldn't, and that increases the chance of someone who has a recently acquired undiagnosed infection entering the blood supply and that being transfused to up to 3 individuals. So the good news, as Minister Beryl signalled, is we have a new study. So we are launching a new study on blood donation and HIV prevention among gay and bisexual men. Compared to 10 years ago, this will be a nationwide study. So not just in Auckland, we'll be conducting this in gay pride events and community settings around the country. It'll be both in person and online. And we hope to launch this in February 2022. So Minister, if you are still listening, it would be great if we're still in level 1 come February next year. And the survey broadly consists of these 2 components. First of all, a survey of combination prevention behaviours and attitudes to blood donation. But then we'll also be inviting people to provide a dried blood spot on a piece of card. And we're going to send that off to a laboratory and have that tested for HIV, hepatitis C, and syphilis. We're going to combine that information to estimate the prevalence of undiagnosed HIV, Hep C, and syphilis in this population. And we'll do that by comparing a positive diagnosis on someone's dried blood spot with evidence that they've either never tested for that infection or that they had and their last test was negative. And of course, we'll use that to update a range of estimates. We'll use it to inform our blood donation policy. We'll use it to inform HIV prevention policy and our engagement in care and cascades of care. But because we're also inviting people to provide their contact details, if they wish, voluntarily, for those who have evidence of undiagnosed infection, we'll be able to approach them and link them into care for the first time. So they'll be able to be linked into care and offered treatments. But more than that, we'll be able to look at people without evidence of infection, but whose behaviours dictate that they might be eligible for PrEP. We'll also be able to return to them links into PrEP services around the country. And ultimately, we want to update our understanding of combination prevention in this new biomedical prevention era since 2015, given again that the last time we did this was in 2011. So broadly, we want to use this data for a number of aims. We want to describe, I guess, a spectrum of MSM. At the top, some MSM whose evidence suggests that they potentially pose a high risk of an undiagnosed infection and who probably ought to continue to be deferred from donating blood. But at the other end of the spectrum, no risk or low risk MSM who could potentially donate safely. And Sue McAllister and I have estimated that we think around 35,000 HIV negative MSM are living in New Zealand. We'd like to know what proportion of them might be able to donate blood. And we also want to understand a number of things about blood donation experiences as well. We want to know, are people aware of the policy, particularly as we've moved to 3 months? What are their attitudes to the current policy? What is their historic and potential future compliance with blood donation policy? And what are some of their preferences of what that might look like? Again, ultimately, what we want to do is use this data to derive a blood policy blood policy that is safer, that's inclusive, it's more inclusive of people who want to donate, but that will also potentially maximize donations by including more who want to donate. What might that like? Well, we have a glimpse of this from the UK. So in fact, the UK in 2021 has moved to a much more individual-based deferral system for blood donating. And deferral there is now triggered if someone has a new partner or multiple partners in the last 3 months and has had anal intercourse. That is an and requirement, a new partner or multiple partners and anal intercourse. What that of course means is that a number of people can now donate who haven't been able to previously. So monogamous individuals over the last 3 months, even if they've had anal intercourse, can still donate. Or people with a new or multiple partners over the last 3 months, so long as they haven't had anal sex, can also now donate. And there are a couple of key things we need to remember here. This is also a gender neutral policy. So this doesn't specifically relate to MSM. It is true regardless of people's sexuality. And that was seen as an important stance to strike in both the UK and Canada. And also has some other caveats. This is based on sexual behaviour. There are, of course, a number of other conditions around blood donating, around travel, around other STIs that we need to be bearing in mind as well. But when we want to strike this policy in New Zealand, doing so rests on as many people as possible from as wide backgrounds as possible taking part. So we want people in come February who know they're living with HIV, know they're not living with HIV, who are highly sexually active, who haven't yet had sex. We want everyone to take part from all around the country, because doing so will give us the best picture of what people's behaviours are, what their attitudes are, and how we might be able to best shape blood donation policy. And this is my final slide. I just want to emphasise that this is a collaborative effort. So I want to acknowledge all our study investigators across the University of Auckland, University of Otago, our peak NGOs at the AIDS Foundation, Body Positive, and Te Whare Ki Whakapau, and also in the New Zealand Blood Service. So this is a collective effort. We genuinely want to try and bring together diverse sets of interests and strike the best policy possible. And it's supported at the highest level. So from the Health Research Council, the Ministry of Health, and the AIDS Foundation. And the link down below is a link to a community summary that we developed in December last year, if you're interested in learning more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. That's an excellent presentation. I think it's exciting to see an update to the estimate of the number of people who don't know they're living with HIV. I think they mentioned it was 20% of people from the 2011 study. So I think that'll be really exciting to see what that number actually is now that all these, time has passed and all these advances have been happening. Hopefully that's changed significantly and people are engaging in testing. Just as a reminder to people, through the chat function below the video in the website, there's a little box that says, if you've got a question in the chat box, you can join the chat. I suggest that you pick there's a triple dot there, which you can click on. It says pop out, and that'll pop the chat box out into a separate window. You can log in, and then you can ask your questions to the presenters at any time during the day. So just, it would be good to have your voices join in the conversation. Peter, just in terms of that, hopefully we are at level 1 in February when a lot of this analysis is going to be happening. Do you imagine, like, how many people are you looking at getting to engage in this in the study? And are you just doing it in Auckland? Is it across the country? What's happening in terms of actually getting a good representation of the different populations to get engaged?
Yeah, well, you just said it exactly. We want both good representation from a broad cross-section of our communities, but also high numbers. So increasingly, we're looking at behaviours that are probably quite rare. And so to make sense of that data, we need lots of people to take part. So we're in fact aiming to encourage around 4,500 MSM from around the country to take part. It will be over several months, starting in February, at different Pride events around the country and online. So people will have lots of opportunities to engage. And we also want to encourage, again, a diversity of individuals as well. So although this is looking at undiagnosed HIV, we really want to encourage people living with HIV to take part, because we're also, of course, testing for syphilis, and we're also testing for hepatitis C. And so for us to make sense of what I think Sue has shown to this forum in the past, and what Aisha Viral mentioned before, the cascades of care, we need as many people possible at different stages of that cascade to be taking part. So we really encourage people to engage with the survey. We're in fact forming our research team around us at the moment. And so hopefully many of you will be approached in your organisations, or maybe in your clinical centres, or if you're from community groups. Please look out for invitations from us to join in a conversation around the study and hopefully help promote it when the time comes.
And so with that, you're sending it out to organizations. So the idea is that we're going to encourage everyone to kind of get the word out there to get as much uptake as we can.
Look, absolutely. And, we want to emphasize that this is voluntary. So people will be invited to self-complete their survey. There won't be an interaction with someone listening to your answers. And And it will also be voluntary to provide a dried blood spot. And we'll lead people through this very, very carefully. Again, there are some enormous benefits to taking part in this process. We know we're getting close to elimination, but to achieve that, it's going to get harder. We need to start reaching pockets of the community who probably don't normally engage, either with our clinical services or with research. So we are going to try harder, and I guess rely on friends and peers to think about people in their orbit who aren't as engaged, and try and encourage them to take part. It's really important that we hear from the voices of a diversity in our community.
Yeah, I think especially in this case, because I think we need to leave nobody behind and make sure that everybody's recognized and heard, even if they aren't engaged specifically within the community as we exist. So I think this will be a really important study, and hopefully it shows a really different picture from where we were in 2011. Hopefully we've moved a long way. So I think that's really exciting. With the UK example that you mentioned, I know they've removed gender as being one of the issues, and just moved it to behavior. Is that something that we're hoping to get from this kind of research in New Zealand, maybe?
Look, I think everything's on the table at the moment. I know that Canada is also exploring a gender neutral policy. In both those countries, that was seen to be very important in terms of the perceptions. It also, I think, reflects their slightly different epidemiology of HIV in those countries. So those criteria which focused on anal intercourse with new or multiple partners reflects, I think, a broader distribution of HIV in heterosexual communities and MSM communities in Canada and the UK. But, it might also make sense here. And so, like I said, everything I think is on the table at the moment. We want to, of course, keep the blood supply safe. That is the paramount importance. We don't want to increase risk to blood recipients in any way. But we also think we can improve its inclusivity and potentially increase the donor pool by allowing more MSM to donate who weren't able to in the past. That will require, quite a lot of tricky thinking. But I think, as is hopefully clear, the perceptions really matter as well. And I think this idea of the inclusion in important civic practices like blood donation is being considered as more and more important. So I think these things are being weighed a little more evenly, and I think we're really excited by it. This is a really genuine partnership by our community agencies, our researchers, our specialists, and the blood service. And we're really looking forward to working on this data for the next few years.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. So we'll be looking forward to seeing that coming through in around February, lined up with Big Day Out and all the Pride activities, I presume, to get the maximum kind of impact. So thank you for making that happen, and all the best. And I hope we're in level 1 so that it could be successful with moving forward.
Kia ora, thank you.
So thank you for that. Again, I've mentioned to people about the chat space in the bottom of the window. If you want to engage in the conversation, feel free to put your questions in there. And they'll be posted to the presenters. Thank you, Peter, for presenting on that information. I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and it's a long time overdue. So I'm glad we're doing this, can make change in this space and be leaders again in terms of the blood banking system. So I think that's really exciting.